Hi, this is Faiza Patel. I'm the co-director of the Liberty and National Security Program at the Brennan Center for Justice. The Brennan Center is a nonpartisan NGO that works on basic issues of justice and democracy. The Brennan Center started working on the issue of radicalization and homegrown terrorism in 2007. That was the year that the New York Police Department issued a paper called Radicalization in the West. The Brennan Center found that the NYPD's paper was not supported by research, and we were very concerned that the theories that it set out justified monitoring large swaths of American Muslim communities, and also that it focused on looking at people's religious behavior in an effort to identify potential terrorists. Earlier this year, we published our own report on the issue, which is called Rethinking Radicalization, which takes on some of these theories of radicalization that have become popular both in law enforcement circles and in the media, and explains why they're not supported by the research that's out there. And I'm talking about both social science and government research. And the paper also discusses the negative impact of some of these theories of radicalization. So that's our interest in the issue. And Arun, I will turn it over to you to introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Arun Kundnani. I'm a fellow at the Open Society Institute in New York. Before my time here as a fellow, I spent a number of years in the UK doing research on the impact of the war on terror on civil liberties there, and in particular on Muslim communities. And I spent quite a lot of time looking at something called Preventing Violent Extremism, which is a policy programme that has been in play in the UK for about 4 years now, which attempts to prevent people from becoming terrorists in the UK. And that was a programme that raised a number of issues from a civil liberties point of view, and from the point of view of how the state interacts with Muslim communities. Since I've been in the US, I've been looking at similar kinds of issues here to do with how does a government actually deal with the issue of preventing people from becoming terrorists. So this is about how do you have policies in place that actually intervene before someone's actually begun to be involved in any kind of criminal activity.
Okay. So as we talk today, I guess one of the things that people often ask is, well, actually, can you prevent somebody from becoming a terrorist? And maybe that's something that we should talk about to start with.
Well, I think this is interesting. The situation we've got in both the UK and in the US at the moment is that the governments in both countries have told law enforcement agencies that you need to have a preventative approach to counter-terrorism, which means you can't wait until someone's already engaged in a terrorist plot before you do something. So you need to be able to predict who is going to be tomorrow's terrorists before they actually become terrorists, right? And that's the kind of key dilemma that for all of this kind of hangs on. So how do you do that? How do you anticipate who is on a pathway towards becoming a terrorist? Well, one way that people propose is to say, look at their religious and political opinions that they currently have, and if those religious and political opinions look like extremist opinions, or if they seem to reflect a religious ideology of extremism, then that's a good predictor that someone's going to be a terrorist in the future. Now, the problem is that if you do that, you're potentially criminalising people simply for their religious opinions. And so that's the kind of civil liberties issue. But the pragmatic issue is it actually the case that someone who has what most of society would consider to be an extreme opinion about a particular religious matter, is that actually a good predictor of of someone who's likely to be a terrorist in the future. And yeah, my view, based on studying a number of cases and looking through quite systematically the academic literature and the policy literature in this area, is that there's simply no evidence that you can identify a set of opinions that people have which could predict that person would be more likely to become a terrorist.
Well, what about cases, some of the recent cases that we've seen in the U.S., which, the category of so-called homegrown terrorism, which involve U.S. citizens or U.S. residents, longtime residents, who have either attempted to commit terrorist acts or, in a couple of cases, have actually succeeded in committing attacks. And I know that there's some debate about whether Major Hassan would count as one of these cases, but even if we leave that one aside, there have been a number of cases over the last decade involving American Muslims. And so how do we explain why these people become terrorists, why they sort of turn against the country where they live?
Well, I think that's a question that doesn't have a simple answer, to be blunt about it. And anyone who thinks there's a simple answer is trying to pull a fast one, in my opinion. I think there's two different things to say here. Firstly, on an individual level, take anyone and look at their life story and ask how come they ended up getting to this point where they did something that is evil and is pathological and extreme and hard to explain, i.e. Carrying out an act of mass violence. How do you explain that? There isn't going to be one thing that's going to explain that. There's going to be the whole life story. But on a different level, I think you have to look at the whole question of how American foreign policy has produced a particular set of issues around Iraq, around Afghanistan, around Israel and Palestine, and that clearly seems to be a factor in a significant number of these cases, where people themselves describe their motivation as to do with they themselves would describe what they're doing as in some way a retaliation, or as in some way an attempt to respond to violence that they see being meted out to their people around the world, to retaliate that violence back with a hope to ending an occupation in another country. Now, what do we make of that self-description of what someone's describing as their own motivation for that violence? It may be that they're just simply someone who has a predisposition to do this anyway, and the kind of political story that they hang on it is just their own kind of pretext for and if it wasn't that, it would be something else as the pretext. On the other hand, I think it's generally to me it's something that you can see throughout history that when you have violent occupations taking place around the world, people do retaliate against that, and that doesn't seem to me to be hard to. I think that's something that's fairly predictable.
Well, there's a statistical relationship, right? I mean, there was a book recently, I think, by a Professor Pape, if I remember correctly, from the University of Chicago, which sort of correlated rates of suicide bombings with occupation, and he talks about virtual and in physical occupation as well. So I think there's clearly this kind of foreign policy context to this, but isn't it true also that a lot of these attacks have been framed in explicitly religious terms as well? So what do we make of that? I mean, how do we disaggregate this political side and this religious side, and what difference does it make, really, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, I think I think you're right. If you look at the videos, for example, made by the 7/7 bombers in London who carried out a suicide bombing attack on the London transport system in 2005, and the leader of those 4 suicide bombers, Mohammed Sadiq Khan, made a video where he tried to give some kind of rationale for why he did what he did, and he talks about the British occupation of Iraq and Britain's involvement in the Iraq War. But you're right. He also brings in a religious dimension. He frames that in a religious language, and one of the interesting questions is why he identifies more with a kind of solidarity with other Muslims more than he identifies with a solidarity with fellow British citizens who were the innocent victims of the violence that he carried out. And I mean, I think that for me, the religious ideology just provides a vehicle to express a set of political grievances.
Okay, I agree with you. I agree with you. Yeah, that's right. But what difference does it make? I mean, what does it matter for practical purposes whether it's a religious ideology or whether it's a political ideology? I mean, when you're talking about as you said, this preventive paradigm, which has taken over a lot of counter-terrorism policing now. I mean, does it really matter if it's a religious ideology or a political ideology? I mean, at the end of the day, aren't you asking cops to basically monitor what people are saying and, by inference, their beliefs?
Yeah, that's absolutely right, and. I mean, I think it matters to the extent that when you have I think that the kind of civil liberties issues are exactly the same, whether you frame this in terms of religious extremism or political extremism. At the end of the day, you're talking about potentially criminalising people for their opinions, and it doesn't matter whether they're religious opinions or political opinions. But when you have a situation in Europe and in the US where you have a wider climate of Islamophobia, of people saying that there's something fundamentally problematic about Islam as a religion compared to other religions, in that kind of environment, when you then add into the mix the argument that there's something religious that's going on with these attacks and that this is a product of Islam, and that something about Islam is inherently producing terrorism, then I think it's important to unpack that and to have a more complex and nuanced account of the role that religious language is playing in these cases.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me that sort of another reason to differentiate between the two is the fact that the sort of the rhetoric that you often hear from law enforcement or from other sources is that you can't in essence deter a terrorist, that there's really nothing you can do except to kind of figure out who's about to commit a terrorist act and sort of prevent them from doing it, that there are no sort of cohesive set of demands that one could even consider from a policy perspective. And I think that by framing the threat as a threat generated from Islam, that argument is much more convincing. It's a lot harder to confront the argument that this violence is a response to certain foreign policy choices that our governments have made. Now, obviously, I'm not saying it's a correct response. I'm just saying that, the way that you frame the problem not only sort of is important because of the general climate of Islamophobia, but it's also important because it allows us, in a sense, to kind of duck those policy questions, right?
Right. So it's easier to talk about this being a problem of Islam than it is to talk about it as a political problem about America's relationship with the rest of the world. And it's and so linked to that is this idea that somehow this terrorism is completely and utterly different from previous kinds of terrorism, whether you're talking about, I mean, in the UK, we've had a terrorism from the IRA for, since the early 70s, and by the 1990s, it's pretty clear that the root cause of that terrorism was a political conflict over the future of Ireland and its relationship with the United Kingdom, and that the solution to that violence was going to be a political settlement, which is what's happened, and I mean now, more people still die in the United Kingdom as a result of that political conflict than as a result of what's called in the policy circles Al-Qaeda inspired terrorism. But nevertheless, that violence has been massively reduced as a result of a political settlement. But the way in which Al-Qaeda terrorism is framed is this is a totally different kind of thing. This is somehow more fanatical, more less reasonable, and policymakers now will kind of have quite a nostalgic attitude towards the IRA, which is kind of weird.
It's interesting. Let me ask you a question about the IRA, because you know much more about it than I do. I mean, obviously, part of the IRA issue was a Catholic Protestant issue, right? But we tend to think of it more as you said, in political terms. And I'm wondering, was there a turning point in which, where this narrative changed?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that. I think that the religion dimension to the conflict was always understood as a kind of shell, right? And that basically it was a conflict about colonialism and the legacy of Irish colonialism, right? And the fact that the people colonised happened to be Catholic and the people doing the colonising happened to be Protestant was not a fundamental. It wasn't a fundamental cause of the conflict, but it became the means by which that conflict expressed itself. Okay, and I think people generally understood that. And certainly there were attempts to kind of say, well, because these people are Catholics, their true loyalty is always going to be to the Pope rather than to the British state, and therefore they're a threat. And because they're Catholic, they're more backward. So some of those same kind of religiously defined themes, were in play. But really, the kind of the fact that this was a political issue was always there. So I don't think there was a particular turning point where politics kind of stepped in and replaced religion as the understanding. But what I think happened in the 1990s was a realisation that the British state could not continue to think that it would be able to find a solution to this problem through overwhelming force and through coercion and violence, and that in the end some kind of political process was going to be needed in order to end the violence, and that took a long time, and that took probably 20 or 30 years.
Yeah, I was hoping that today we could talk a little bit about some of the theories of radicalization that have been floated out there, because that's something I know that I've worked on, and I know that you've also worked on, which present this idea that you have a pool, if you will, of potential recruits to Al-Qaeda and Al-Qaeda-inspired movements, and that this pool consists of a group of young Muslim men, generally second-generation immigrants here in the United States, and that, they may at some point in their lives have some kind of personal crisis or awakening or some kind of cognitive opening is how a lot of times it's described, which leads them to become more religious and which in turn eventually leads them on the path to terrorism. Now, these theories, I think you and I will probably both agree, have basically been debunked. I mean, there is really not a sort of significant or sound social science basis for these kinds of theories, yet these theories are very prevalent. That, you know, we still talk about these modes of being, and when you read in the media, for example, about terrorism cases, they often talk about radicalization. I remember when when the guy from Connecticut who tried to set off a bomb in Times Square was caught, that there was several articles in the New York Times, for example, that tried to trace the process by which he came to embrace terrorism, and they talked about, you know, the kinds of things that are sort of almost stereotypes, that he stopped drinking and things like that. But it seems to me that there are so many cases that don't fit that profile, especially recent, very high-profile cases. And I was wondering whether we might talk about two cases that particularly struck me. One was the case of the Newburgh Four, who were these four men who were recently convicted here in New York for planning to bomb synagogues and shoot surface-to-air missiles at planes. And then the second case that I thought would be interesting to talk about would be the Jihad Jane case, which involved a middle-aged American woman, you know, Caucasian, who apparently decided that she wanted to be part of a plot to assassinate the Swedish cartoonist who's been reviled by Muslims for his cartoons about the Prophet. And to me, these two cases sort of are so important in explaining why the kinds of stereotypes that radicalization theories encompass are not correct. So I thought maybe we could talk about those two cases a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I think if we begin with the Newburgh 4 case,
Yeah.
I think we should say to start with that this is quite an unusual case in the sense that you have a number of African American men who have actually been interacting with an informant for a very long period of time, and an informant who seems to have played a role in which he's been putting a significant amount of pressure on these men to be involved in a plot that he was kind of conjuring up and inventing in order to see if these men could be pressured into participating in it, and then resulting in a conviction, which would seem to also involve a financial reward for the informant. And so this case is certainly the defendants are making what I think is a very strong case that they were entrapped into this, and that were it not for the informant initiating this process of pressuring these poor people to be involved in effectively a made-up plot, then there wouldn't have been any risk of any kind of terrorist activity here anyway. So I mean, I think, yeah.
No, I mean, I'm just wondering, I mean, how do you see sort of the kind of radicalization theories that the NYPD and the FBI talk about fitting into a plot like the Newburgh Four? I mean, it seems to me that there's got to be a connection between how the FBI and the NYPD think about how terrorism happens and why they would go after these kinds of defendants.
Right. You know, I think that what the model that the NYPD and the FBI have is a model in which it's a pyramid model in which the
funnel, I believe,
or a funnel. Yeah, it depends which way around you look at it.
Exactly.
I've seen it. Yeah, you're right. Let's talk about it as a funnel. So at the top level is a pool of people which is the entire Muslim population of the United States. Then at the next level down is a subsection of that population who are on the next stage on this kind of funnel down into terrorism, And the next stage is one in which they've started to adopt a more conservative approach to their religion, or a more fundamentalist approach to the religion, perhaps changing the way they dress, perhaps growing a beard.
Stopping smoking and drinking, I believe, are high on the NYPD.
Stopping smoking and drinking. And so there you've got a kind of pre-radicalization phase. Then the next stage down is a phase where you have people who are supposed to be sympathetic to terrorism and a kind of one step away from terrorism. And then the final stage is the people who are actually involved in criminal activity. So the point about this is that you're imagining that there's three kind of steps between being a Muslim and being a terrorist. And it's only the very last step that involves any kind of criminal activity.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're in the middle two steps, then you're being seen by law enforcement as a potential terrorist risk, even though you're not breaking any law.
So you think that the fact that there were these men who had sort of petty criminal past, these 4 African American converts to Islam, and they were in essence mouthing off about their negative views about the United States and anti-Semitic views, and you think that the cops just took this and engineered a plot out of it?
Well, I think that certainly happened in a number of cases. I think in this particular case, it might even be worse than that, in the sense that there's some evidence that the defendants were actually pretending to express these views precisely because they wanted to get the financial rewards that the informant was offering, and they didn't even really believe that stuff, right? So they started coming out with anti-Semitic stuff just to repress this guy.
Right.
Because he was offering them money basically to hang out with him and pretend that they were terrorists.
Right.
I'm not even. I mean, I think these four men have actually probably been identified simply because they were very vulnerable, having come out of prison. They had a history of involvement in petty crime, and they were seen as people who are easy to kind of rip off in this way. But certainly in other cases, you do have people who are expressing, views that would be indicators on that funnel of radicalization, such as the view that the West is at war with Islam, or the view that Muslims are Islamically obliged to keep themselves to themselves and not interact with non-Muslims. So views like that, which are seen by law enforcement as indicators of risk and as signs of radicalization, the expression of those views seems to have been the pretext. There are a number of cases for the FBI to mount an operation with informants and to end up producing convictions that to me look very much like entrapments.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the thing that I think about, two things about these kinds of cases, and I think Newburgh 4 is sort of the paradigmatic case in this category. And one is, the FBI or the NYPD is presumably really convinced of the danger that these folks present. Because otherwise, why would they spend their time and money going after these guys like the Newburgh 4? So that's one thing. And then but at the same time, I'm so unconvinced that these kinds of people pose a real danger to us that I wonder why they're spending all their time and money on these kinds of cases. So I think that's sort of the question that makes people have.
I think my take on that question is that we have legislated in the United States for a preventative approach to counter-terrorism, and that has filtered down to the FBI, so that the FBI agent who's involved in counter-terrorism has to kind of square this circle that cannot be squared, right? Where they have to be able to predict who's going to be tomorrow's terrorists, when that is an impossible prediction to make, right? And if you talk to FBI agents, they're kind of aware that they're in this kind of impossible position. and funding and resources are driven according to your ability to deliver terrorist convictions on that basis. So I think there's structural incentives in the system for you to go about things in the way that the FBI is doing, and you may not even really believe in this funnel model of radicalization.
Do you think they do? Do you think the FBI agents you've spoken to believe in that model?
I don't think FBI agents are any less bright than us people in the civil liberties community. I think they also understand the flaws in this model, but I think they've got a job to do, and they haven't got another model, and they've been told they have to do something in a preventative way, so they've got no choice but to have some means to kind of do this kind of profiling of future risk, and they don't have any other way of doing it, so they fall back on this even if they don't really believe in it, and that's the kind of structural issue that we have at the moment within the FBI. And the other thing is that this is also something that involves quite complex relationships between the FBI field offices and Muslim communities. Mm-hmm. So the FBI field offices will go to some lengths to build up relationships with partners in the Muslim community who will come back to those field agencies with their kind of insights on what they think is going on in the community and whether there's a risk. Right? But those partners in the Muslim community are also incentivized to say that these are the dangers, and this guy in the mosque seems to have started talking about these kind of extreme views, so maybe you want to look out for them. So this filters right down even to the even within the Muslim community. It seeps in as well. So it's very rare that you would get a situation where anyone in this whole process is going to step back and say, okay, well, there is someone in the mosque who is talking about things in an extreme way, but that's his First Amendment rights, and that's legitimate, protected free speech. That's part of what makes this country. That's how we do things in America. We have this First Amendment. That hardly ever happens, right? Because of the whole attitude we have to counter-terrorism, where we don't have a very balanced view of risk in relation to counter-terrorism. We have this idea that we need to do everything we possibly can to stamp it out, even if that means, getting rid of some of our fundamental civil liberties.
One thing that I was hoping that I think we're going to be running short of time pretty soon, but I was hoping to touch on one more thing, which is the role of the internet, and to maybe look at the case of Jihad Jane to talk about that, because one of the sort of threads that's come out recently is this idea, and you've seen the head of the FBI, Director Mueller, making this point, which is that a lot of quote unquote radicalization now occurs over the internet rather than in face-to-face encounters. So the early version of these theories was that a guy would go to a mosque, he'd either hear a preacher who was giving a radical message, or he would come in contact with other people at the mosque who held extreme views, and that would sort of help him along the path of radicalization. And now the theory seems to be that there's a different path, a virtual path, if you will, which involves reading on the internet about what's happening, getting different people's views on that, including radical views. And obviously al-Awlaki is the main example that's cited in this regard. And that then leads people to commit terrorism. And, when you look at this one situation, which is the case of Jihad Jane that I mentioned earlier, where you have this, middle-aged white woman living, somewhere out in Texas or maybe Pennsylvania, I know, is where she was actually indicted. And, you know, she's been married or has a long-term boyfriend for 5 years, and he doesn't know anything about her becoming radicalized. It's not like she's going to a mosque or associating with other Muslims, but she's on the internet, she's reading about what happens to Muslims around the world. She becomes concerned about this and is eventually seems to be in touch with people who are actually interested in carrying out terrorist acts, and then goes to Europe in an effort to do this. What do we make of that, and how is that going to change the whole policing calculation for us?
Well, I think that there are cases that of individuals who are using the internet to connect with other people who want to be involved in acts of terrorism, and that is probably more likely to be the vehicle than certainly more likely than a mosque, and possibly now becoming more likely than the kind of gathering in someone's front room. Which was what happened with the 7/7 London bombers. Mm-hmm. But what that means is firstly, although people will kind of talk about learning to make a bomb on the internet, in reality, the kind of level of threat is therefore much less if you're only learning to do it on the internet, as opposed to learning how to do it through interaction with experts face to face. And so the cases where people have been radicalised on the internet are cases where often the actual bomb hasn't gone off, or if it has gone off, it's not inflicted as much damage as it would have otherwise done. And I think what you get to the point where really what you're talking about is a number of individuals who are either teenagers who are going through kinds of emotional crisis that teenagers often do go through, or people who are older who are also going through some kind of crisis in their life, and somehow or other find chat rooms and spaces on the internet where they pick up a certain worldview, which then ends up becoming a way that they kind of deal with those emotional issues. Now, the question is what can we do as a society to kind of manage those kind of phenomena, particularly with teenagers. And I think certainly I think there's some models that do exist in Europe where you can put in place mechanisms whereby there are youth workers and teachers and other people who can provide spaces for young people to work through those issues without getting to the point where they become involved in violence. So there are kind of preventative models out there for dealing with that very specific kind of issue. But I think also we should kind of get I think we get to the point where when we've gone from 9/11 to where it's an act involving the death of thousands of people, mass violence, arguably a warlike act. From 9/11 to something like Faisal Shahzad, who is on his own trying to detonate a bomb in Times Square, and someone who's had some kind of interaction with people who can show him how to make a bomb. When you get to the point where you're talking about a 17-year-old kid who's on a website and wants to try and make a bomb, then it's starting to look less and less like this scary thing called terrorism, and more like like something like the Columbine shooting cases, where it's not really about terrorism but about young people who end up involved in very serious violence. But nevertheless, it doesn't seem to me that terrorism is the right label anymore.
Yeah, I mean, it does seem as if we're overusing the label terrorism. You know, there's eco-terrorism, cyber-terrorism.
Right.
You know, it seems that everything bad is now labeled terrorism, which sort of takes away from the significance of real terrorism, which is a very scary thing, and sort of degrades the word.
You know, there is an issue around how the word is used in relation to Muslims, because you can have a situation where someone goes postal, as I think the phrase is in America, goes postal and picks up a gun and shoots a few people in a shopping mall, and no one would call that terrorism. But if it's someone who's Muslim, then it would be a terrorist attack.
If someone goes on a shooting rampage and that person is a Muslim, that it would be categorized as terrorism. So.
Right.
Well, I think we've kind of reached the end of our time here, Arun. It's been great talking to you, as always.
And you.
And thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye.